I acknowledge that I speak today from the traditional lands of the Kabi Kabi people and pay respect to the past, present and future traditional custodians and elders of this area and this nation. I recognise that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have nurtured and educated children on this land for thousands of years. I respect that history and actively look for ways to celebrate the continuation of cultural, spiritual and educational practices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. I would also like to make viewers aware that this presentation contains images or names of people who have passed away. Today I wish to discuss the impact colonisation has had on the lives of Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians and the relevance this historical and cultural knowledge has for teaching and learning in Australia. Nelson Mandela famously said, "Education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world." Marcus Garvey passionately spoke of, "A people without the knowledge of their past, history, origin and culture is like a tree without roots." Elie Wiesel concurred, "Without memory, there is no culture. Without memory, there would be no civilization, no society, no future." Mahatma Gandhi so eloquently pointed out that you must not lose faith in humanity. Humanity is an ocean. If a few drops of the ocean are dirty, the whole ocean does not become dirty. These sentiments epitomise my pedagogical aim in respecting and promoting understanding of all members of my class and the world in which my students find themselves. Educators are in a unique position to influence, guide, support and expose their students to all aspects of learning within their lesser and greater environment. 21st century Australian educators have the opportunity to develop an understanding of and a mutual recognition of all aspects of Australian history and to help their students move forward together with all in our community. The accurate representation of historical events is vital to a well-informed, well-adjusted and empathetic society. As Ongingi states, history impacts greatly on society because the interaction between society and its past is an unending one, mutual and continuous. The past exists only in the mind and memories of those in the present. The reality of past events is shaped by historians and those in society who pass on these accounts, for example, educators. Group memory and self-perception of society is formed by the passing on of historical fact. When we say that the past interacts with the present, often what we mean is not the past in terms of actual happenings, so much as what perceptions, what memories we have of the past. As we are aware, for a number of years, an accurate history of colonisation was not passed on to our society, creating an ill-informed and uncaring view of Indigenous, non-Indigenous relations and the position of Indigenous members of our society. The social and economic impact of invasion, colonisation policies and the control of Indigenous people has accumulated across generations. It was amplified by policies and practice that have systematically disadvantaged Indigenous people. In many instances, this has resulted in the transmission of trauma, poverty, and other forms of disadvantage from generation to generation. The use of British colonisation was terra nullius, a legal term which claimed the land, Australia, belonged to nobody. This blatantly denied the existence of Indigenous Australians as human beings, a fact that lasted until 1967 referendum. This problematic relationship has never been fully resolved, even in light of the Mabo decision and resulting native title claims being honoured. British colonial powers never entered into any negotiations about land with the Indigenous communities. Many Indigenous people continue to feel the pain of occupation, dispossession, and a lack of recognition. The absence of a treaty highlights a lack of engagement and relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. Thousands of Indigenous people fought colonisers for their homelands, families, and way of life. The omission of these resistance wars from our history misrepresents Indigenous people as passive and continues to affect both Indigenous Australians' perception of themselves and the distorted perception many Australians have of our history as a peaceful settlement to be celebrated. Populations were devastated and Indigenous people were dehumanised by the colonists in order to justify the horrific acts against them. In many cases, these events resulted in a loss of cultural knowledge as generations or family groups were murdered. The truth about massacres has been left out of our national history, and many Australians are quite shocked when they come to realise that what really happened in the towns and places where they now live. The lack of acknowledgement of these events invalidates the experiences and suffering of many Indigenous people and is an ongoing source of pain. In contrast, New Zealand's Maori people are a source of national pride, famed as warriors and formally recognised in their nation's history through the Maori Wars, and were also active participants in formal treaty negotiations. Legislation and state policies serve to exclude Indigenous people from participation as citizens through their removal from their homes to reserves, missions, and cattle stations, where their everyday lives were lived under regimes of surveillance, control, lack of liberty as equal citizens. Today, many Indigenous people still experience the effects of the missions and reserves. Some are living with the trauma of growing up in these often abusive environments. Others have been displaced from land and family as a result of the reserve system. The forcible removal of Indigenous children from their families was part of a policy of assimilation. The generations of children removed became known as the stolen generations. Assimilation, based on the assumption of black inferiority and white superiority, proposed that Indigenous people should be allowed to die out through a process of natural elimination or, where possible, should be assimilated into the white community. Children taken from their parents were taught to reject their Indigenous heritage and forced to adopt white culture. Their names were often changed and they were forbidden to speak their traditional languages. Some children were adopted by non-Indigenous families, and many were placed in institutions where abuse and neglect were common. These policies of child removal have left a legacy of trauma and loss that continues to affect Indigenous communities, families, and individuals. The removal of several generations of children also severely disrupted Indigenous culture, and consequently, much cultural knowledge was unable to be passed on. Many members of the stolen generation never experienced living in a healthy family situation and never learned parenting skills. In some instances, this has resulted in generations of children raised in state care. From the 1940s, in most parts of Australia, the state governments issued thousands of exemption certificates. They gave their Indigenous recipients citizenship rights that they otherwise didn't possess, yet which were enjoyed by the non-Indigenous majority of the Australian society. They included being allowed to vote, attend school, enter hotels, and be exempt from the restrictions of state Aboriginal protection laws. However, applicants had to agree to abandon association with the Indigenous community, give up their culture, connections with country, and end contact with their Indigenous kinship, except for their closest family. In short, exemption certificates forced many Indigenous people to sacrifice their Indigenous identity in order to obtain a very basic level of freedom enjoyed by other Australians. This interfered with Indigenous family life. The need to show certificates to police officers in order to be permitted to exist in public spaces was also a source of humiliation and shame. Exemption certificates contributed to the sense of being a second-rate member of society, as well as the degradation of cultural knowledge. In some cases, this has contributed to a lack of self-esteem and a weakening of Indigenous identity that continues to impact generations of Indigenous Australians today. Since the arrival of the British in the 18th century, Indigenous people have been marginalised in all aspects of life. I'm not sure if 21st century Australians can truly fathom the concept that there was a time when the Australian society did not consider Indigenous Australians as human beings, living, breathing members of society with rights, feelings and opinions on their lives and the greater community. I would like to share with you a quote found in McGregor which helps illustrate the longevity of damage to the Indigenous psyche by colonisation. There's a simple reason why I want a huge yes vote on the Aboriginal question at next Saturday's referendum. I want to be accepted by white Australians as a person. There are scores of other reasons why the vote should be yes, but for most Aborigines it is basically and most importantly a matter of seeing white Australians finally, after 179 years, affirming at last that they believe we are human beings. Despite Indigenous people's efforts to maintain and revive culture in the face of colonisation, there's no denying that colonisation has deeply impacted Indigenous cultures, societies and languages across Australia. This has had a strong impact on Indigenous people's sense of identity and belonging. Cultural disconnection and the weakening of identity is the underlying cause of many of the struggles the Indigenous people are dealing with today. To move forward, it's essential that we openly acknowledge our history and validate the pain it's caused. As Vass states, educators need to promote a regime of truth. We must recognise that the land we live on and prosper from was previously inhabited by Indigenous people, and their displacement wasn't founded on mutual agreement. That social and economic impacts of invasion, dispossession, marginalisation and control of Indigenous people have accumulated across generations. This impact has been amplified by policies and practices that have systematically disadvantaged Indigenous people, and in many instances has resulted in the transmission of poverty, poor health and other forms of disadvantage from generation to generation. Indigenous people have courageously resisted and sought to overcome adversity generation after generation after generation. This mutual recognition and understanding of our shared history is a foundation from which we can hope to move forward together. Two events in Australian history resonate strongly with my belief in the possibility of change: Gough Whitlam's speech in 1975 and Kevin Rudd's apology in 2008. I would like to share with you the words of Gough Whitlam, which changed Australia's idea of itself.
Constitution which we perform today will not stand alone. Your fight was not for yourselves alone, and we are determined that Aboriginal Australians everywhere will be helped by it. And I want to give back to you formally, in Aboriginal and in Australian law, ownership of this land of your fathers.
These events, both, to some extent, provide an Indigenous voice and perspective of the respective events, exploring how Indigenous Australians interpreted and experienced the world around them at this time. As educators, my hope is we too can build not only our understanding of Indigenous perspectives, but to also strengthen teaching skills and the pedagogy required for effective Indigenous education. I would like to close my presentation today by sharing with you an excerpt from a performance the Year 1 class I am currently on placement with has given today at the Noosa Library. The level of which Indigenous culture, traditions and languages are being embraced at this primary school assures me that as an educator I too will find the support and skills to put the lived experiences of Indigenous Australians at the centre of my teaching and learning practices. As Ernie Dingo and Call so rightly points out, we all know how to say yes in Spanish, don't we? We all know how to say yes in German, don't we? We all know how to say yes in French, don't we? Do we know how to say yes in any of the 360 Aboriginal dialects in this country? Let's remedy this. Let's embrace Indigenous language, culture and peoples, because as my students will tell you, Ning, Ningdu, Nali, Australian. We are all Australian.